Hello everyone. This is Adam with psychedelicinvest.com, and I hope you guys are all having a phenomenal week. In today's episode, we are going to be straying from the formula a little bit. This is going to be a special episode. So I'm going to be having a conversation with Scott Freeman. Scott Freeman, the former chief medical officer of both Savant and MindMed. So Savant is essentially the company that turned into MindMed. Him and the people he represents own about 5.6% of MindMed. So it's a pretty significant amount of shares that he has between him and the people who he represents. And my goal for this interview was essentially just to get his perspective on video. I just think it's easier when you're having a conversation with someone to kind of understand where they're coming from a little bit better. And I tried to ask questions that MindMed investors would have in mind and that they would probably most likely be asking him as well. So I hope I did a good job of, number one, just getting questions answered for MindMed investors, and also just giving him a platform to just express what he needs to express, because I think he makes some very good points. And we'll see as in the interview, and I hope to hear your thoughts on this interview. So leave a comment, please. And let me know how this went and how you liked it. And feel free to just drop any other questions you'd want me to pass on to him in the future, because I plan on doing a couple more of these videos with them, hopefully. So without further ado, let's get to it.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for having me on and being able to address your listeners. My name's Scott Freeman. I'm a co-founder of Mind Medicine. I'm a physician, and so my background is in drug development. I've been in drug development actually since I was 17 years old in high school. I started in academics and was doing basic and clinical research. I started actually in high school as a work-study program for my senior year in high school. I was working at, I grew up in New York, so I was working at Sloan Kettering Memorial Hospital in their research labs, and also making rounds with the clinicians in cancer immunotherapy. So I got my start, continued doing research through college, medical school, internship residency, and then I went to the National Institutes of Health. I was involved in early gene therapy studies. Actually, I was an investigator on the first gene therapy study in the late 80s at the NIH, then went to Tulane as a professor and was doing basic clinical research there. And after that went into industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and have done drug development for the last 24 years. I take drugs from phase 1, which is we evaluate toxicity, to phase 2, we develop or see some of the efficacy, to phase 3, which is a large trial to show that the drug is safe and effective to get FDA approval. And so I've been doing this basically for almost 50 years, from an academic perspective and a pharmaceutical industry perspective. About 13 years ago, I partnered with Stephen Hurst, and we founded a company called Savant. And Savant was a private company, and we were working on drugs to treat addiction. It's called 18MC. And it was developed from a psychedelic ibogaine. So that's how we sort of got started in sort of psychedelic or psychedelic-inspired medicines. And from there, about 7 or 8 years later, we met 2 investors who shared our vision and shared the vision of psychedelics. JR, we call him, who's John Monron, and Leonard Latchman. Both of them were investors. And they approached us, and we had the same vision and decided to take Savant from sort of a private company into a public company, Mind Medicine. And as we developed into Mind Medicine, we also wanted to get into psychedelics. And like I said, we had the drug 18MC was psychedelic derived, but we actually wanted to also get into the psychedelic field. And as we started, we looked over the landscape or what was being developed in psychedelics. And as probably your viewers probably know, psychedelics have obviously been around since the 50s. They were scheduled in the late 60s by the FDA. And probably about 20 years ago, different groups, private groups and non-for-profits started working on them. And now probably the last 6 years, pharmaceutical companies or biotech companies like Mind Medicine have gotten into the development field. And so as we were looking at sort of what was being, what we should develop, psilocybin was being developed by several companies. For a number of reasons, we chose LSD. And LSD, one, it probably was unique or unique. We were one of the first companies to be engaged in developing LSD. But also, I personally think that LSD is a better drug than psilocybin. I don't want to downplay psilocybin. I think that's a good drug. I don't have scientific data that can convince you, but my gestalt was that LSD was a better drug. And as we chose LSD, we then, from a company perspective, wanted to work with the experts in LSD. And that led us to Basel. And Basel is not only the place where LSD was discovered, but also in Basel is an investigator, Professor Lechty. Professor Lechty had been working with LSD in Basel for at least a decade, I think even longer. And myself and JR went to visit him. We also share the same vision. And so we decided to partner with Professor Lechty. And Basel, or the University of Basel, where he's at, is part of our Center of Excellence. And the important thing also about Professor Lechty is that he had a lot of experience with LSD. So a lot is known about LSD. I think a lot's also known about psilocybin. I think, as you know, over the last 50 years, millions of people have obviously taken LSD. So, the safety profile, both from a general public perspective and from studies done by Professor Lechty, he's treated well over 100 patients, has demonstrated sort of the safety and efficacy of LSD.
Oh, I definitely can get behind those sentiments. LSD, in my opinion, is going to have one of the biggest impacts on the psychedelic market in general. I also think for indications such as ADHD and even autism, it could be a very interesting psychedelic to look at. So thank you so much for that introduction. And I guess what I wanted to find out more from you is, so LSD is what you wanted you want the focus to be, correct?
Correct.
So now,
there are other psychedelics that Mind Medicine is working on. There's other psychedelics that Professor Lechty is working on, and I think there's going to be other platforms that emerge. But I think the initial focus, or the initial, let's say, first to market, is LSD.
So, what would be the goal in regards to patents around LSD for you guys? Because I feel like that's what a lot of the investors are focused on in terms of how are we going to generate money from this. If you can answer.
Yeah, that's a good question. And although LSD has been around for 50 years, it's good and bad, right? So there's a lot of data on it. So one thing I like about LSD is that, one, there's a lot of data, right? Even from personal people's use, right? We know it's a fairly safe drug. We know the toxicity of the drug. In fact, LSD and psilocybin are two of the safest drugs in terms of from a physiological perspective. So the effect on the body's organs, no one's ever overdosed and died from LSD, or I believe psilocybin. I know for LSD, but I'm pretty sure also psilocybin, from a toxicity like a heart attack, kidney failure, or liver failure. So in some ways, it's safer than aspirin in that effect, that regard. And so we know it's safe. The unsafe part is the effect on the brain. So have people died from LSD? Yes, they've jumped in front of buses, jumped off bridges, those things, suicide. So that's a safety issue, obviously. But from a physiological point of view, the effect on the organs in the body, overall, there's never been a death that I'm aware of from an overdose of LSD. In fact, there are reports where some teenagers thought they were snorting cocaine and actually snorted LSD and took 1,000 times the dose. And obviously were in the ICU for a week, but survived, and apparently without sequelae. So like you said, I think it's so we know it's fairly safe. So that's and also I think, like you said, they're anecdotal, although, there are anecdotal studies on the internet, as you know, where people with ADHD have taken it and also anxiety. And if you do the reports, right, or if you do a survey, which isn't the best scientific data, it's not randomized control study, but for the most part, the reports come out that it's helped people. Now, could it be a placebo? Yes, but with all the people have taken it, with all the anecdotal reports out there, with the safety profile, that's the good side about a company developing LSD. So for the most part, I'm 95% sure it's safe, except again for the the mind altering effects, but overall physiologically it's safe. And I also have a lot of confidence that there's efficacy there. And also, Professor Lecter has done some randomized trials that also show its efficacy. But so there's a lot of data out there, both for its safety and its efficacy. So the downside, as you brought up from a company perspective, is how do investors make money? Because most investors want patents. And as a physician, I've gone into drug development to help people, but on the other side of it, what I believe is that if I can find a drug that helps people, investors are going to also make money. So, they work hand in hand. And so I look at my first priority is to help the people. Second priority is to make money from investors, but they go together. If I can help people, the investors are going to make money. So again, to your question, how do you make money, or how in a drug that's been around for 50 years, that it's not easy to patent, or you don't get what we call composition of matter. So composition of matter patents is you own the structure of the drug, whereas, quote, a use patent is where you own its use. So the way you get patents in part is by filing use patents. And so since LSD, although it's been around for a long time, it really hasn't been well studied in the academic or pharmaceutical industry. So every time you put a drug in a person, you're developing novel data and potentially patentable data. So there are things that come out when we treat patients that are unique and novel that become patentable. So even though we can't patent LSD itself, we can patent some of the effects of LSD that it has on people and different diseases.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you for answering that. So, like, I would also say, like, are you guys also exploring possibly like LSD analogs as well? Because I feel like that would be, in terms of patenting and intellectual property, you would have a much easier time there as well.
Yeah, so I can't comment on confidential things at My Medicine, particularly that I'm right now not at My Medicine, and there are things that I might know from being at My Medicine that's not public. But I think that there are 2 points to that. So the point is, all companies are looking at novel patents. I think they have on their website a novel MDMA, which is an enantiomer of MDMA that has potentially a better side effect profile. So I believe so that is on their website. So the answer would be yes. But you also have to be careful because, for instance, if you develop, let's say, psilocybin, I think this may be one of the issues that companies with psilocybin may have, although I'm not the expert on commercialization or how to make money off psilocybin. But think about it, if you develop a unique psilocybin where you can patent it, and you can do that, you can make modifications to psilocybin, they'll give you the same effects as psilocybin, and you can patent it as a novel compound. The problem becomes is that if it doesn't do anything better than psilocybin, just because you have a patent on it, you may be able to charge more money for your drug that's novel, that's a novel psilocybin. But if it does the same thing, people will just go to the quote, the generic psilocybin and do it. And in fact, people could just take mushrooms, right? I mean, we sort of understand what the dose of psilocybin is an equivalent in, magic mushrooms. So let's say you find that psilocybin at, I believe the dose is 25 milligrams, I think they're using, at 25 milligrams cures depression, right? Why can't you just go take 25 milligrams of psilocybin in a magic mushroom and you'll get the same effect? So, so there are those issues. Just because something is necessarily patentable or novel, unless it does something better than whatever's out there, people buy the cheapest stuff, right? Why go and buy a more expensive drug when you get a less expensive drug that does the same thing? So I think if you look at my medicine, again, I haven't been involved with my medicine or the MDMA, but from what I read on the website, I think it appears that they have an enantiomer, which means it's MDMA, but with a different chiral structure, or it's positioned differently in space. And by making that enantiomer, it seems that they may get the same effect as MDMA and less side effects. And if that's true, then you actually do have something. You have a novel compound, which is the enantiomer that hadn't been discovered before. So you can patent that. And then you can also, use it instead of MDMA because it has lower toxicity, and people will pay more money to get an MDMA that's less toxic, if in fact that turns out to be the case.
Got you, and I definitely agree with that. That was great. And so the next question I want to ask you is so 18MC. This is something that that has been brought up a bunch from you guys. So I want to hear. So in terms of where do you think MindMed is? Where do you think things kind of started to deteriorate in terms of the way MindMed has been approaching 18MC, and why do you guys believe in it to the point where it's one of the pillars of reasons that you're going at MindMed right now?
So 18MC is an interesting drug. One of the scientific founders of Savant is Dr. Stan Glick, who was at Albany Medical Center, who's now retired. So this gets back again to the psychedelics. So you've probably heard of the drug Ibogaine.
Absolutely.
And Ibogaine, apparently, my understanding, was first used. It's used in Africa for religious ceremonies. But apparently, the counterculture movement in the '60s, the hippies, were basically looking for the best hallucinogen. And so they were testing different drugs. And apparently, the story goes that they tested Ibogaine. Although Ibogaine's supposedly a good hallucinogen, not maybe as the best, apparently the next day they felt it cured their heroin addiction. And so they started to import it, right, to give to their friends, to use heroin and you can sort of cure your addiction. So of course the FDA got wind of it and then scheduled Ibogaine. And so Ibogaine is now used at a lot of offshore clinics. And I think a lot of the Hollywood stars that you hear going to Mexico or the Caribbean are going for Ibogaine. So again, this was an interesting drug when we first licensed it at Savant back in 2009. It was an interesting drug because again, there's anecdotal data that worked. We knew the safety profile from Dr. Glick's work in animals. We also knew that in animal studies, to treat addiction in rats for cocaine or methamphetamine, it worked identical to Ibogaine. So again, from anecdotal data, I had some confidence, anecdotal data being the public at large using it, I had some confidence that it was a good drug. We had confidence in the safety data. And Dr. Glick basically made 18MC to take the side effects out of Ibogaine. So it's non-hallucinogenic. There's also some cardiovascular and hypertension side effects from Ibogaine. 18MC doesn't have it. So we thought this was a good drug. If it does the same thing for addiction or helps cure addiction as Ibogaine and it has less side effects, this is sort of a home run. So that's how we got started in it. And then when we started Mind Medicine, it was one of the drugs that came over that we started Mind Medicine with. And then we went out to Professor Leppi and started with LSD. So LSD and 18MC were the two core drugs that Mind Medicine started on. Now, Mind Medicine, I think, and even at the time when I was there, started to get more into the other psychedelics. But I think 18MC was still one of the original drugs, and as you know, it was being developed for opioid addiction, and that's a major health crisis, and also if it works, getting back to investors, it's good for investors too. So it's potentially good for the public and good for the investors.
Agreed. I mean, the ibogaine, in terms of the way where its status is among the psychedelic community, it's very highly regarded in terms because of its efficacy. I have many friends who have gone to these ibogaine retreats and come back changed people in terms of it
Right.
completely curbing addiction.
Yeah. So again, I'm a scientist. We call that anecdotal data. It's not randomized or controlled. But if I start hearing enough stories, it gets me interested enough. And then I look at animal models. And animal models, you can cure addiction in rats. And also you get pretty much the same results in rats with ibogaine as 18MC. So it seemed like, yeah, this was a good bet, a good thing a good thing to develop.
Oh, and I think a lot of the people in the MindMed community would agree with you as well. I know that 18MC was one of the main focal points of excitement around MindMed for a long time. So it was very unfortunate to hear that they were going to stop the research or stop putting money into 18MC in their most recent
Yeah,
earnings report.
yeah, I was a bit disappointed, and one of the reasons why I want to go back is to see if it can be revived. And I think that to me one of the issues is that they reported the phase one study, and they spent a lot of time and money developing a 7-day dose. And a 7-day dose isn't going to help opioid addiction. So the only thing a 7-day dose will do is help potentially symptoms of opioid withdrawal, which isn't a bad thing to do as sort of a quote side project. If you're already developing a dose, you're going to get a 7-day dose on your way to a 30-day dose. So if you could take the 7-day dose and do symptom withdrawal or affect symptom withdrawal, that's probably a good thing. But to stop at the 7-day dose, right, doesn't get you to test whether it works in the real thing, opioid addiction.
Understood. What do you think the perspective for them was in terms of stopping at the 7-day dose? Was it to save money?
I don't know. That's
Okay.
one of the reasons why I'd like to, I as a co-founder, I left my medicine. I've been sitting on the sidelines watching, and one of the reasons why I want to go back is that there are things I think need to be done differently, and I don't know. I suspect why it was stopped, but I don't want to comment further than I think getting a 7-day dose is not, stopping a 7-day dose. They didn't stop, my understanding, and they announced this way, that they stopped for toxicity, right? So it's not that this is a toxic drug that can't be used as far as anything I've heard. So if it's not toxic and you have a 7-day dose, why don't you get a 30-day dose? And as to your point, it sounds like they're going to look for, quote, non-dilutive financing, which is basically either grants or giving it to the academic community. But if you're going to do that, even if you wanted to do that, I would have gotten a 30-day dose and given it out to do that. So what's the academic community or grants or whoever you're going to get your non-dilutive financing going to do with the 7-day dose? Not that much.
Yeah, understood. Okay, so that brings me to my next question. So, in regards to, as you've been sitting on the sidelines this whole time, you have a significant amount of MindMed shares. Was it 5.6% of the company?
The group that I'm with has 5.6, but I have a lot of those.
Okay, so while you're
I think it was reported in the press release that it's probably in the 4% range.
it was very significant, very significant. Yeah. So it's like, as you're sitting on the sidelines and you're watching kind of MindMed evolve as a company. So and if you can't even talk on this, but where would you see in terms of where they could be doing better? And I know you mentioned this in terms of the report that you put out. But I feel like I'd want to hear you explain it in terms of like, so what have you been seeing in terms of things that they could be doing better? Where are your worries in regards to MindMed?
So there's 3 things. The first, we're not going to be talking about this in sort of my area, but one is burn rate. I think that biotechs, this is still a small biotech, basically, and you really have to conserve cash and focus your resources. I'm not sure I was very pleased with buying digital medicine. I think digital medicine is important, but you can't be great at everything. You have to focus. There are other companies that do digital medicine that have more resources, so they're probably better, and you can sort of rent or hire, contract if you need those things. So that's just one example, but I think the burn rate in general is probably high, and I think it's somewhat of a lack of focus. But the second thing was the one thing that we discussed, 18MC. I sort of knew that there was this 7-day dose, and I was, even while when I on the sidelines, suspicious that they weren't aggressively going after the 30-day dose. So again, that's one place where I differ, but I had to wait till they haven't, over the last year or two, they haven't announced a lot of things that were going on. I think this last earnings call you heard a lot, and part of it may have been because we were pressuring them. So this was the first I really heard about where they were with the 18MC, although I think they published some of the phase 1 data. But again, even then, I thought that the focus was too much on the 7-day dose as opposed to, I think, where it should have been on the 30-day. So that was one thing from the sidelines. But I couldn't step in a year ago because they just say, well, you don't know, it's confidential, you don't know what we're doing, and I didn't. So I had to, sometimes you have to wait, too long on sometimes until you can step in, even though you suspect something. The second is LSD. As we discussed, there's a lot of data on LSD, and Professor Leckie has done a lot of really good studies, and particularly he's done studies in anxiety. And I think, I think it's known that the focus for mind medicine is on developing LSD and anxiety. And even when it was announced, whatever, a year or two ago, that they were doing a, quote, phase 2B trial. I'm not quite sure what phase 2B means, but basically it's, they're testing 4 different doses against placebo to, quote, to try to find toxicity and quote, the right dose to treat anxiety. So, so you first have to go through that, and those trials take 3 years to do. And if you do that first, then it's another 4 years to get to do your phase 3 trial, to get your drug approved. So the drug's approval is 7 to 8 years away. And I'm here to help patients and also help the company. And and as you talk about with investors usually aren't going to invest in something that's 8 years away and getting to approval. So the question is, how do you help patients quicker? And by helping patients quicker, you're going to also, as we talked about, have a secondary effect of helping investors. And so, in my view, if you look at all the data on LSD and anxiety, and Professor Leckie and his group, Dr. Gasser is also part of his group. I think he has a private clinic. I'm not sure if there's a university associated, but the two of them have worked closely over the last basically 8 years, and there are 3 phase 2 studies in anxiety that show the efficacy and show the dose that should be used for LSD and anxiety. So why do you have to do a phase 2B to find the dose? And in terms of toxicity, because some people say, well, we need to understand the toxicity of the different doses. Well, Professor Leckie has also done a study where he's compared the toxicity at different doses of LSD. This is in healthy volunteers, not necessarily anxiety patients, but it's not that different. So based on 3 phase 2 studies in LSD for anxiety, and I believe all of them were randomized. Yeah, I think all of them were randomized. The last one being a 40-patient randomized study that had a p-value of 0.007. So for those who don't understand statistics that well, the chances of that happening just by chance is somewhere probably in the neighborhood of probably 1 in 250. Now, to get a drug approved by the FDA, usually you need, for one study, you would need a p-value of 0.01, which is basically one chance in 100. So you're probably about somewhere, beyond that, maybe twofold better than that in this small phase 2 study. So it's you sort of the dose, right, and the safety profile. So why do we have to why are you doing a 200 patient phase 2b that's 5 arms, which is a very complicated study. Once you add more than 2 arms to a trial, why would you do that rather than going into your phase 3 trial and getting the drug approved in 4 years as opposed to 8 years, 7 or 8 years? So I think, hearing that, and also the 18MC, made me decide that mind medicine looks like, I think has lost their way, and they need to refocus and refine it.
All right, everyone. So this is going to be a two-part interview. I didn't want the runtime to be too long. The interview itself was over an hour. So this is going to be the end of the first part, and the next part will be uploaded tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. In the next part, we get into some of the more juicy things in terms of the relationship with Orbiter, as well as what Scott Freeman has to say about people calling this a pump and dump attempt on his behalf. So, yeah, we're going to break those open in the next conversation, which will be out tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I hope I did a half decent job representing kind of the mind med investors in some capacity in the way I ask these questions. And yeah, like I said, feel free to send me a message on Reddit or Instagram if you want me to ask him specific questions in the next interview. I'm more than happy to do that. My name on Reddit and Instagram is WAXINGELOQUENCE. That's Waxing Eloquence. WAXINGELOQUENCE. I appreciate each and every one of my viewers. Thank you guys so much for supporting this channel. And yeah, stay tuned for the ending of this in this interesting conversation I had with Scott Freeman. So stay tuned for that, guys.